Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Dr. Brian Jordan, who is an excellent Civil War historian, and he's written this fantastic book called Marching Home, which talks about veterans' experiences, specifically Union veteran experiences post-Civil War. It's fascinating reading. I think as we get into it, folks are going to learn a lot that maybe the actual history of the veterans' experience is not the sanitized version we get from watching newsreels or looking at some early 20th century pictures of these, lions in winter type veterans, and that these guys had a real tough integration experience, a lot more akin to what you might have seen with what's popularly associated with Vietnam veterans, or maybe even some of the experiences our current veterans coming home from overseas operations are seeing today. So with that as set up, Dr. Jordan, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So let me jump right into it here. As I kind of in the setup alluded to, and we talked a little bit before, the veterans experience that you have gone to great lengths to capture in Marching Home really shows guys who, they believed in what they did. Obviously, you don't spend, at least even 9 months in a Civil War marching regiment, especially if you go into combat, without wanting to be there, or at least feel like you had a cause to be there. And a lot of these guys kind of felt shortchanged after the fact. They earned their victory, they got home, and it seems as though, contrary to popular myth, their communities really kind of wanted to forget about them. So could you let the audience give them an understanding of how you kind of determined this in your research and what even led you to write this book?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I mean, Marching Home, I think as you describe it, is the story of the men who won the war, but couldn't bear the peace that followed. And the men who fought the Civil War understood keenly what was at stake in the conflict. These were deeply ideological soldiers. We have a huge literature on soldier motivation during the Civil War. James McPherson's For Cause and Comrades comes to mind. And if you accept that argument, right, these men understood exactly what they were fighting for, what was at stake. This is a struggle for slavery and self-government and union. Then you have to accept that when they returned home and saw a lot of those things going backwards during the days of Reconstruction, this was a really traumatic thing for them. We forget all of the time that Northern soldiers returned home to a society that had reached no consensus about emancipation, about its necessity, political, military, or otherwise, about the participation of so many men in unprecedented violence. And there's really a civil war on the Northern home front that complicates their reintegration. And we don't talk about that quite a lot, but I think it's something that we should consider, right? Because of the parallels, striking parallels with the experiences of 20th century veterans.
So when you talk about no consensus was achieved, I mean, that's a really brilliant way of putting it. You think when you're fighting for a cause, there's an idea that there's a unified either ideological or political force behind you, but you may have come from a community that was strongly Copperhead, peace Democrat type folks, or you may have had people come from folks who thought, well, the Union needs to be preserved, but I don't really give two figs about freed men or anything of that nature. So there was no unified narrative of what the cost was. The interesting thing to me was because of that lack of a unified narrative, you kind of wonder what were the communities even celebrating? Was it just the idea that we're one nation again? And what did these young men represent to them? Did they represent victory? Did they represent unification? Or did they just represent an unpleasant chapter that they would, much prefer to forget, except, once or twice a year?
Sure. I mean, National Reunion is obviously central to Northern war aims, right? This is a war for reunion. It's a war to bring the 11 seceded states back into the national polity. But Union veterans are very clear about this. They want a measured reconciliation. They want a reunion that's mindful of what exactly had brought us to this war in the first place. And they were very clear about that this was a slaveholders' rebellion, that the Confederacy had fought to establish a slaveholders' republic where all men were not created equal. Part of the challenge here, Ben, is that veterans are moving well beyond their pre-war selves in post-war civilian society on the questions of race. And in many of them, certainly not all soldiers, but many of them are, I think, radicalized by their experiences in combat. They have come up close and personal with the physical and material realities of slavery. Some of these folks that come from, white, rural farming communities up north, they had never known an African-American person. They'd never come in contact with an African-American, and the experience on the front lines, right? Coming in contact with freedom-seeking enslaved persons who are rushing to the Union lines to seek sanctuary, being piloted through swamps and in the fingers of woods by freedom-seeking enslaved persons who volunteered as scouts and guides for the Union Army. Right, in the participation of 189,000 African-American soldiers in the Union armies, right? Those bonds of comradeship that were interracial. These things helped white Union soldiers move beyond where they had been before the war, but also helped them to move beyond where their communities were. And so they had this sense of authority over the meaning of the war. They felt that they were to be the custodians of the war's legacy. And when white Northern civilians wanted to kind of put their own spin on that, when they wanted to sterilize the conflict, when they wanted to segregate the narrative, the story of the war, they deeply resented that. And it prompted so many of these frictions that made their post-war experience all the more traumatic.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think it's a case of, on a macro scale, that these are young men in their communities at the time that they leave, they have very little social credit. They come home, as you say, radicalized. They come home with tremendous experiences. They feel they have an authority that needs to be exerted, but they have no lever of power with which to exert it because they didn't have any social credit when they left, and people want to put them back in their niche when they get home. Is there something to that idea, or am I just going off on a tangent?
I think there is. I mean, it's important to point out that so many of these veterans will become politically active and they achieve political success and they begin to organize, right? The Grand Army of the Republic, the largest fraternal society for Northern veterans, gets off the ground in 1866. And it will eventually swell to a membership in the hundreds of thousands. And that has a deep influence over government policy, over questions of veterans' benefits and hiring preferences, pensions, these sorts of things. So they do try to find that power, but they always feel as though they can never truly control the historical narrative, right? Because historical narratives, especially over wartime, are always contested. And the stories that we tell ourselves, one of the takeaways that I hope people emerge from marching home with is the stories we tell ourselves as a nation about war matter, right? And they matter in particular in the lives of veterans, right? Cultural memories can have lived social consequences. These men return home and have to live in and occupy this illegible space between their own raw, visceral reality of what it was like to fight at Antietam and Spotsylvania and Shiloh. And they live in this kind of twilight zone between that memory and then what the nation prefers to remember. And that's a very, very awkward and uneasy and uncomfortable and disillusioning place in which to live.
Now, when we talk about what the nation is preferring to remember, is there obviously there's an economic element there. You've got an industrialized North that now, if the countries reunifying, they want to be able to do business with the states in the South. Obviously, men who participated as members of the Confederacy are going to be the folks with whom they are doing business. Do you think that the primary drivers were economic in order to achieve this rapid reconciliation versus the measured reconciliation the veterans were advocating? Or what was it, more of a social driver? Was it an intellectual driver? What pushed the larger Northern communities to want to have a sterilized narrative so quickly, especially in the face of so many, I'll just use the term ruined young men coming home, whether they're missing a limb, whether they've had a life-altering wound, or whether they're just not all there mentally anymore?
Mhm. I think economics is no doubt a part, right? There is a urgent, tangible need to reestablish commercial ties between the sections. It's also important to point out again that one of the principal Northern War aims from the very beginning, and the one that remained paramount in the minds of many white Northerners, is this idea of union. But I think beyond that, right, race becomes a real engine of sectional reconciliation, a shared racism between the sections. Obviously, former Confederates were fighting to preserve slavery and to create a white slaveholders republic, but they're not all that different from many white Northerners on the question of race. And in this urgent need to try to find some sort of national healing, to broker a peace, to move forward as a nation, that shared racism becomes a foundation, right, for accepting this lost cause mythology as we progress farther and farther into the late 19th century, into the beguiling world of the Gilded Age, right, with all of these impersonal forces changing the qualitative character of life in America, right? Industrialization, mechanization, urbanization, industrialization, all of these isations and isms of the Gilded Age, right? People want to look back and remember nostalgically the moonlight and magnolias notion of antebellum society, when life was somehow simpler, right? And they start telling stories of the plantation days. They start telling loyal, faithful slave stories, and you can see that the lost cause serves to assuage a lot of anxieties in late 19th century America. Anxieties about the future. It's what historical memories do, right? We turn to the past in the present because of our anxieties about the future. And 19th century Americans did this all the time. And the Southern narrative was just so much more alluring and so much more intoxicating in that way than it was to and help to elide all of these deep and tough ideological questions that frankly we just didn't want to confront, right? Who wants to confront the reality that the Confederacy went off to fight to preserve and extend slavery?
Yes, sir. And you've opened up the lost cause mythology door, so I'm going to run right through it with you.
Sure.
Do you obviously the North had to be complicit in the lost cause mythology gaining the foothold that it did. When I was a young man, and I'm due to turn 52 this year, so the lost cause history was basically just Civil War history, at least right. In popular history when I was young and first learning about it. And you start reading, Alan Nolan or some other authors, and it's like, wow, this is some really radical stuff here that they're positing. And the idea that, again, these young men who are now achieving middle age, some of them achieving some level of political success, were not able to stem the tide and get their own narrative out there. Marching Home certainly has some great scenes that you allude to in the later 19th century. Some other books also have these types of things where people are attending their first veterans reunions, and are we going to invite Confederate soldiers here? And in the popular mythology, it's like, look at this great reconciliation, but in reality it's kind of like, well, they can come but they can't wear their uniforms, or they can come but they can't put monuments up, or they can come but they can't have a speaker. But you would think with that level of curating, the Northern narrative would have stood a chance, but very quickly the lost cause mythology gains this foothold where it's appearing in textbooks. It's just the history of the war now. It's not a competing narrative. So was the lack of a common narrative from the Northern side from, immediately from the 9th of April, 1865 onward, that lack of a narrative was just unable to compete with what the South was able to get into the history books? It blows my mind that these guys who wanted their legacy preserved were unable to get their voices heard throughout the second half of the 19th century.
Well, memory is always contested, right? And even historians and scholars of Civil War memory to this day debate, right, whether reconciliation was ever the dominant paradigm and the extent to which, when exactly did the lost cause triumph? We debate these things. I mean, they were always narratives that were in conversation with one another, right? The emancipationist memory of Union victory was always in dialogue with the lost cause. But I think it's fair to say, right, that the lost cause had very talented writers, filmmakers. It had all of the levers of power, even Ivy League historians. I mean, you mentioned how Northerners become complicit in the lost cause mythology. I mean, we can think about the Dunning School of Reconstruction historiography, which wanted to make Reconstruction into a vengeful period of bayonet misrule, and turned emancipation into a tragic mistake that heaped military despotism on the South. Right? I mean, that comes from the pen of William Archibald Dunning, who was a tenured professor at Columbia University. So they have academia. They have these talented novelists and writers and filmmakers. D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation. Organizations like the Southern Historical Society, the activism of veterans groups. And again, the lost cause speaks to the urgent needs of late 19th century Americans in a way that the Union cause narrative just doesn't, right? And increasingly, right, the message that Union veterans are given from white Northern civilian society is, you won the war, get over it, right? Union victory was not something that needed to be explained. Confederate defeat of its own necessity, right, invited looking back, invited explaining why did we lose this war? What contributed to Confederate defeat? I mean, Civil War military historians still do this today, right? All of the backwards looking. Victory invited people to look forward. Defeat of its own bleak necessity invited people to look back.
And that's a great summary. But as you point out very clearly in the book, victory comes with its own bleakness as well and its own necessities. Yeah. And that you saw that in the persons of these wounded soldiers who strove to get pensions. A lot, lived lives of quiet desperation. Some chose to take their own lives. And there's a lot of lessons there and a lot of parallels with, as you indicated, of what we've seen in the 20th century. I'm having trouble enunciating today, but the popularly what we see with the notions of Vietnam veterans, although there are plenty of stories of success among Vietnam veterans as well. I don't want to peddle tropes, but and even today, young men and women who have served in the military post 9/11. There's a lot of campaigns trying to bring awareness to the struggles they still have, despite well-meaning programs that the government's putting together. And these 19th century veterans lacked a lot of those well-meaning programs. There was this idea that you stand on your own 2 feet, you figure it out, and if you don't, just go elsewhere so we don't see you struggling. And I got the sense from what you were writing is that was just the ethos of the time. A man was expected to stand on his own 2 feet, take the consequences of his decisions. You chose to serve, or you chose to honor your commitment if you were drafted, something like that. So now come home and get on with things, and don't expect a handout, don't expect to be a burden. Just, why aren't you being productive? Was that truly a matter that's how the times were? It was just a time of self-sufficiency and tough love? Was there a sense of collective guilt? Hey, we feel really bad that we sent you guys to do this on our behalf and we don't want to be reminded about it. Is it a combination of those things? Am I missing something? I was just really surprised being a post 9/11 veteran and seeing how, now granted, a 21st century government cannot be compared to a 19th century government. I totally get that. We have so many more social programs. The idea that the executive has a lot of authority, the legislature should be serving the people, the notion of a welfare state. I got that was not a thing in the 19th century, but still, having been exposed firsthand to all those programs available to veterans, I was blown away by the struggle, even for pensions, recognition of sacrifice, the idea that even that it's not a good idea to have a memorial to you guys because it's going to make you feel special and there's nothing special about you. I can't put my finger on what the driver of that type of reception was, whether it was the ethos of the time or a collective guilt or something else.
I think there's a lot going on here, and I think you put your finger on several elements. I mean, one, I think Civil War era Americans are still very much under the sway of classical small r republicanism, right? Which is deeply suspicious of standing armies and fears, quite literally. I mean, there's a great fear when veterans return home in a lot of northern societies that they are going to continue to exert force, right? We as Americans still today, right? We separate the military from our civilian policy making. We don't like the notion that the military makes or enforces policy, right? And in the 19th century, that's particularly pronounced. And so there's this fear that it's going to be another gathering army and that they're going to continue to wield this sort of special status in post-Civil War life. I think that's a part of it. I think it is an era of laissez-faire individualism and the law of local sympathy. More than that, though, I think there's not yet diagnostic language that connects the experience of going to war, the experience of coming under combat with a lot of the maladies and the ailments that men are dealing with and suffering with after the war. And that goes not just for the mental scars of war, but for the physical disabilities as well. There's not a good, solid understanding, right, that some of these wartime injuries and chronic diseases are not linear, right? And that decades after a period of exposure, decades after a battlefield wound, that's when something is going to physically manifest or mentally manifest for one of these soldiers. So it's the lack of medical diagnostic language, it's the sway of classical republicanism, it's this notion of laissez-faire individualism. And it's also, as you point out, the lack of an infrastructure, right? I mean, we have just a nascent pension bureau. There's nothing like the Veterans Administration. There's not yet the bureaucracy. Just as the nation is stunningly unprepared for a war of this unprecedented scale, so too are they unprepared for the challenges of the peace, right? They want to quickly demobilize. They demobilize 800,000 men by June of 1865 and then set them on their way, right? And they took this as a success without really thinking through, what the demobilization process would look like and what it might entail. And it's to the veterans' credit, right? In the book, I try to make the claim that the Grand Army of the Republic, we should think about the GAR as really the origin point for a modern notion of veterans' rights, because they start to connect a lot of these dots that government and society really isn't connecting, right? They connect, veterans understand keenly when they make their pension claims, when they seek their hiring preferences, when they're delivering their Decoration Day speeches. They connect what they had physically and emotionally and mentally experienced on the battlefield with their post-war behavior. They make the connection between, right, the sacrifice of 4 years or of their lives with, an enduring obligation that the government owes them, right? They were willing to write a blank check payable up to and including their life, and now they're owed something by the government. The notion that military service opens a contract between the soldier and the government, right? A lot of that language that today we take for granted as a veteran's right or a veteran's entitlement, right? It's first worked out around these Grand Army of the Republic campfires. These aren't just pension beggars, but these are folks who are trying to deal with the intellectual piece, the ideological piece of how do you, as a society, send men off to war? What obligations do you have when they return home? And what obligation do you have to ensure that their voice continues to matter, that they have an audience, right, that is receptive and respectful of their message, that they continue to exert and wield authority over the historical legacy of that war, right? It's why I'm often frustrated in modern conversations, right, about veterans issues. And certainly it's easy or should be easy for the government to take care of, delays at VA hospitals, but response of Congress and our policymakers is often to throw money at the solution, or to deal with efficiency, bureaucratic efficiency. And those things are all well and good, and we need to do those things. But that's the infrastructural piece, right? There's the intellectual piece that we still really haven't reckoned with as a nation. There's no ritual of reintegration. There's no, how do you afford a modern veteran, a platform from which to tell his story or her story authentically, truthfully, in a venue that's going to be respected and where there'll be a receptive audience. That to me is the great challenge, right? You can solve the other questions, budgetary, infrastructural, efficiency. The intellectual piece is the one that's really demanding, the one that we've never gotten right.
Yes, sir. And that's actually quite fascinating, because I was really interested when you were discussing the idea of a platform and the intellectual piece, the number of these guys who were, obviously they were literate men because they were recording their memories, but they were by no means trained writers or born authors. But the number of them who turned, pen to paper to try to record their narratives and gain some type of a platform, oftentimes because they were hoping to sell their story to be able to stretch their pensions or in lieu of a pension. But the idea now that veterans can at least turn to a podcast or a YouTube channel and just get the discussion out in the public commons, there was no commensurate 19th century equivalent unless it was getting something into Century Magazine or finding someone who's willing to do a subscription for a book, but a lot more difficult than it is now.
That's absolutely right. I mean, Century Magazine had its eminently popular Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, but it was publishing basically officer level manuscripts. I went through their records at the New York Public Library when I was working on Marching Home, and you'd see all the manuscripts that enlisted men, former POWs, are sending earnestly off to the editor, and they're being rejected because they're not famous, or they're being rejected because they're too embittered, right? And the editors would write that you use harsh adjectives, and it's too raw and visceral. We want, right, the war from the officer's perspective. So many of them turn to regimental histories, right? And the regimental history, as a genre, right? That too is something that we can date to the Civil War experience. More than 700 federal regimental histories of men who just earnestly wrote and illustrated their books with hand-inked campaign maps and wanted to detail and document every last thing that they had done for posterity, believing that they were the first true historians of the Civil War, that they were the custodians of what they had done. And I think that's a facet of veteranhood that we just haven't taken seriously, and we can see cognates of that too trickling down into the 20th century.
So there's three strands that continue to emerge as we're having this conversation, and they all terminate the idea of well, why does this matter today? And the strands that I think I've identified that I'd like to articulate here and get your opinion on is the first strand being, is there a lesson for how we treat veterans moving forward and how these soldiers are treated? That's number one. Number two, is there a legacy that's still affecting our social programs and how we interact today, either regionally, culturally, between our classes even, and how these veterans were treated and how their narrative was recorded and preserved? And then lastly, as books like Marching Home make their way out into the public commons and people see a competing narrative to what they think the history of the war is that going to change the historiography? I mean, is Marching Home a one-off, or is this, I don't want to be all glorious about saying, is this a vanguard of a new approach to Civil War history? But is there a more nuanced analysis that we're going to see in books like Marching Home, or do you think that at least in the public mind, we're always going to be in Douglas Southall Freeman land?
I'll tackle that last one first, because I think we are amidst a revolution in Civil War historiography in the last 10 years. That seeks a more nuanced narrative, that seeks to understand human experience and what it means to be a human at war, what it means to be a society. at war. Certainly, my book was not the first book on the veterans' experience, but it contributed to this larger moment. We're seeing an outpouring of veteran scholarship now. Books by Jim Martin and Dylan Carroll and Jonathan Jones and Sarah Handley Cousins, Barbara Gannon, so many others who are working on these questions of what did veteranhood look like for disparate cohorts of veterans, for African-American veterans, Union, Confederate. We're starting to see work on widows, what the war did to families. And so there is this emerging conversation, and it tends to be darker. It's not necessarily triumphal, right? I think previous generations of Civil War historians always kind of felt under an obligation to kind of reify this triumphal narrative, exceptionalist narrative of the Civil War, the Ken Burns narrative, if you will. And we're kind of reaching beneath that and seeing that, they're just a range of experiences. And certainly not all veterans, came back hopelessly embittered or disillusioned. Again, there's a range of experiences. So I think it's an exciting moment in Civil War historiography. We've turned to so many different methodological tools. We're thinking about the environments of war. We're thinking about the history of emotions. We're thinking about masculinity, about so many other facets, sensory history, that have illuminated the war as a human experience. It's no longer this hushed epic, but it's a real visceral human experience. And it doesn't end in 1865, right? It continues on, and it affects so many folks. Battlefield events have tactical significance on the ground, but they ripple out into families, into wives or widows or orphans, communities, and kind of tracing the human topography of the war is something that I think my colleagues now are doing and doing quite well. The other questions remind me the other threads that you wanted to.
So the other threads, sir, were being both in the narrow space of veterans' experiences, but in the larger space of just how society's interacting today in the 21st century. Why does marching home matter? What lessons are there to impart to today's people, today's American population, on the lessons of the Civil War and how we interact today?
Yeah, I think one of the great lessons is that we need to find a way to listen to veterans' stories, right? And that veterans need to be the subjects of their own stories. And, so often we want to treat them as objects. Civil War Americans wanted to do that as well, wanted to deride them as pension beggars, did not want to hear the urgent truth of their experiences. And veterans need to continue to have that authority over the historical narrative of the war that often won't align with preferred national narratives about the war, but we need to find space to acknowledge the difference, I think.
Gotcha, sir. And does this, in acknowledging that difference, is that affecting the way you're training your own students versus the way you were trained in Civil War historiography? Is there a change in the sources you use? Is a change in the subjects you're discussing? Are you even addressing drum and bugle history at this point? Are you talking about strategic, operational, tactical stuff? Or are you talking about the veterans' place in society and the larger sociological impacts of warfare?
Mm-hmm. So I was trained broadly in the Civil War era. I have a firm training in military history, although I think of myself more as a social and cultural historian. I do think that battles and campaigns matter. I think it's important to understand what happened at Shiloh or what happened at Spotsylvania. But I also think that it's impossible to understand what happens on those battlefields without understanding the societies that send men off to war. And so I think there's two sides of the same coin. I don't think squiggles and arrows on a battlefield map can explain the totality. I think you need that larger context. And certainly in veteran studies, I mean, that's one thing that veteran studies can bring to the Civil War is to expand the story beyond 1861, 1865, and not just beyond 1865, but to think about who these men were before they came into the war, because that ineluctably shapes who they become as veterans. Too often in our Civil War histories, we want to pretend as though enlistment papers are birth certificates, and we excise, right, that complicated life that they had before the war that shaped who they became as soldiers, and in turn who they became as veterans, and
Yes,
how
sir.
they navigated those transitions.
Yes, sir. And it's amazing how in terms of the lifespan, you've got somebody, a Joshua Chamberlain, for example, born in the late 1830s, early 1840s. I couldn't say his birth date with any authority, so apologies to anyone who was expecting that. I do know he died in 1914, though, so we're talking a significantly long lifespan. And he was only a soldier for 3 years of his life. I mean, his regiment wasn't even raised until 1862, and he's out by 1865. But he's defined by those 3 years for a great many Americans, and some will argue he's defined by 90 minutes on Little Round Top. He certainly embraced that in his own writing, although he went on to 4 terms as governor of Maine, a great professor, a man of letters. So how much more so somebody who didn't get those types of experiences, they go back to a life of genteel obscurity in Reading, Pennsylvania, or someplace. Maybe their one claim to fame was they were at Antietam or something like that. I don't know if are we doing them a disservice by defining them so narrowly, or did they see that as the defining moment of their life, maybe, and that became part of their identity?
Well, I do think it becomes the defining moment of their life. And I think that's an aspect of Civil War veteranhood and Civil War trauma that we don't pay enough attention to, right? I mean, we focus on the physical wounds, the physical disabilities. We have an emerging literature on mental trauma, but we don't think about what it meant to return home to civilian society, understanding that the most important thing that you accomplished when you were 18, 19, or 20, and then to live the rest of your life in the shadow of those experiences. And the way that, the war continues to annex their lives in ways big and small, right? Not just in terms of battle anniversaries and going off to monument dedications and reunions, and the way that veteranhood becomes real work for so many of these folks who are active in the GAR, who are raising funds to erect monuments or care for the sick or look in after the widows, right? For them, it becomes real work, and they ride the lecture circuit, as it were. But the war also annexes the lives of veterans in more mundane ways, right? Civil War memory is not just that monument dedication ceremony. It is the stump that weeps pus. It is the crooked fingers that ache. It's the periodic flashbacks. It's the sense of a survivor's guilt, which was very real for so many of these men. It's, again, wrestling with what the nation had done with their victory, right? Had they squandered the radical promises of the war? So many of these men, right, they could deal perhaps with what had happened and what they had seen at Antietam or Gettysburg. What they couldn't deal with was the sense that it might have all been in vain. Yes, that what they had fought for was going backwards into the days of Reconstruction, that we were abandoning that notion of a new birth of freedom, that the spirit of rebellion, as one veteran put it, was as alive and well in 1870 as it was in 1861. The sense that there was no public conversation about how do we punish rebellion, how do we punish treason, how do we acknowledge what this war was about? Again, that question of authority, that question of historical narrative, those were very difficult things for them to work through, and those are questions that would annex the rest of their lives.
One thing that as you were speaking, it struck me, going from the big questions that you just articulated back down to the individual experience, that just the idea that the war's over, a young man wants to get on with his life, but even his own circumstances won't allow it. The idea of the pension examiner, you
Yeah.
know, you're coming to see if I qualify for a pension. So even if I've been trying to mentally get beyond my, you know, what happened to me during the war, and I'm trying to focus on the future, I've got to break out my old kit, show you my wound, and I literally have to regress in order to be able to prove to you that I deserve a pension which I qualify for. And that almost strikes me as a microcosm for what you're talking about. Is this worth it? Regressing like this to get this pension?
Absolutely. I mean, in one of the more humorous anecdotes in what is otherwise a very dark book, you know, one of these veterans who was subject to these prying examinations wrote that if the pension examiners, right, if the government had you know, taken as much scrutiny on the way in as they were enlisted into the army, right, there wouldn't have been an army. And that was true, right? And that's true for the men with the physical disabilities, but imagine those with the invisible ailments,
Yes,
right? With the raspy coughs, or the you know, the effects of chronic disease, or diarrhea, things that, you know, weren't the red badges of courage. Veterans who returned home without any knowledge of where the regimental surgeon went, and now he's in need of a regimental surgeon's affidavit to, you know, tether his injury or his ailment back to wartime service. The lack of, you know, and you see this all the time in pension files. They're trying to find the language to talk about what we today would call post-traumatic stress. Trying to articulate that in a society that, again, privileged independence, privileged virility, privileged, you know, economic independence. It's a difficult thing, right?
Yes, sir. It's just a completely amazing field. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Jordan. I hate to break contact on such a fascinating discussion, but I know you have things you need to attend to. I really appreciate your time. Folks, this has been Ben Powers with the Commander's Voice. My guest today has been Dr. Brian Jordan. His book is The Excellent Marching Home, which is sheds light on a very little studied aspect of the Civil War experience, what happened to veterans after the war, and it bridges academic and popular history in a very readable and excellent way. So, Dr. Jordan, thank you once again for joining me today.
Thank you, Ben.